Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our first session today, and we are very excited about this one because we're going to try a brand new format called stand-up debate. Before we get started on this, let us have a quick look at our topic and what it means, kind of looking a little bit at the definition. So our topic for this conference is perfection versus good enough, adjusting to context, scale, and funding. And yes, I'm sure you've all heard this before, but I'm also very sure if you try to exchange your views or your notions on this with your direct neighbor, you might not come to the same conclusion on what it really means, because it's not so easy to pinpoint what it really means. Let us have a look at perfection. I have to own up, I'm a person that likes to do things really properly, paying great attention to details, to the dismay of my colleagues sometimes. And if I have to venture a definition for it, I would probably say it's the best that I can do or any of my colleagues can do with unrestricted time and unrestricted funding. But this is where it comes in. There's no such thing as unrestricted time and unrestricted funding, which my 12 years with CartONG have actually taught me. Because if you actually take 2 months to get the perfect information product out and the situation has changed, then the product is going to be obsolete when it's finished. And that's no use, it's wasted resources. If we now look at the notion of good enough, let me take an example. Okay, I've got 2 kids. It's Friday afternoon after a very long week of work with lots of deadlines. And I try to do an assessment on the ground. I look around in my apartment. I've got 1 hour left to do something about it before I have to pick them up. And needless to say, I have to adjust my notion of what's good enough this week in comparison to what might have been good enough the week before. I have to adjust it to the scale, the context, the phase, and the funding. And if we take this example a step further, let's say I helicopter in my mother-in-law to take an assessment of what's good enough of the situation right now. I'm pretty sure she won't agree with it. And she won't agree with what my notion is because she doesn't know the context. Also, it's not so very clear-cut. Where does one end and where does one begin? You might have set your scope very clearly for, let's say you're going to do a map and you know that you're going to focus on all the locations with more than 1,000 people because this is adjusted to the work that you need to do, adjusted to your context. But then if you don't get that right, if you don't get the technical aspect right of matching your P codes, your populated place codes with the information that you have, or any kind of unique identifier to match your 2 tables, and you don't do that perfectly, you're not going to get a map out. Every one of you who have ever tried to match tables based on location names knows it's a nightmare. It's almost impossible, and it's very, very difficult. So I don't want to give more examples because I want our debaters to shed a light on the notion of what is good enough. What is good enough for them? How do they determine what is good enough, and what does it really mean? And therefore, I'd like to introduce them. I'll start with ladies first. Sonia Karkare from MSF. She is the head of the GeoMSF program right now, looking at scaling GIS services, GIS products, leveraging the architecture so that the people, the staffing, as well as the public can benefit from it. And she has extensive experience with the non-profit sector and with the private sector on that particular question of leveraging and scaling digital transformation. Round of applause for Sonia. And then we have Lars Nissen. I think many of you know him. He has also been at the GeONG in 2016. He is with ACAPS. He has been with ACAPS for 9 years. He's known as a thinker, as someone who's really thinking on how to make the humanitarian sector, or delivering of services in the humanitarian sector more effective. He's been coining the term H to H, humanitarian to humanitarian, which means delivering services, humanitarian organization delivering service to another humanitarian organization. Basically what ACAPS does and what we do at CartONG. And ACAPS has been writing a guide, Humanitarian Needs Assessment, the Good Enough Guide. So it'll be very interesting to see the notions that Sonia and Lars will bring to the debate. And we are very happy that we actually could secure them to come here and speak. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Vincent Taillandier. He's our Vice President with extensive experience in the humanitarian, and he leads us through the process. So over to you, Vincent, please.
Good morning, everyone, and it is my pleasure to facilitate this first debate for the GeONG. We would like this conversation to highlight how perhaps helpful and reassuring is this good enough approach, but also perhaps how disturbing is this concept in our daily work. I mean, according to me, in my perspective, this became year after year a kind of standard in the humanitarian sector, and I guess it's also available for the development one. While listening to our two guests, I encourage everyone to start to think personally, but also collectively, how you deal with this good enough approach. I think we already have an insight from Sandra, a very interesting one. In practice, the debate. So we're listening to Sonia and Lars for Lars' experience and perspective during 15 minutes. So they will address directly to you, the audience, because the idea is having this conversation. And after that, I encourage everyone to share his experience, again, perspective, ideas, questions perhaps to the speakers or to the audience. This is very important. And to investigate further this concept. The debate is in English, but if you prefer to express yourself in French, you're more than welcome. I'm sure that there is somebody close to you that can help you. For those that are not French speakers, I'm sure somebody can help you close by. It's very important to feel comfortable in this conversation. In order to give a chance to everyone to speak, I encourage everyone to be for brevity and also be very clearly in their contribution. From my side, I will be facilitating this debate, making sure that everyone has a chance to express himself or herself, but also to guide perhaps the conversation if we just, by a few questions. Sonia, Lars, first, thank you so much for joining and accepting to open the conversation, because it's all about opening it, something that we will be talking and building on over the next 3 days. And Sonia, I think you are ready to perhaps to open the conversation. So, according to you, how would you explain, according again to your personal experience, where is this good enough approach coming from? And something, what is you exactly make you believe in this approach? Because you told me that for you there is no other choice. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes? I think I'll be a little bit more comfortable standing up on stage, just the way you have been. So, good morning. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. And an honor to be addressing all of you at the start of such a important conference. So the first thing that I'd like to start with is giving you a very affirmative statement as to why I believe in good enough. And that's because the rate of success that I have experienced with it has far exceeded the times when I did not use the good enough approach. So why did this happen, and how did I reach this point? So I've been serving as a technologist in the nonprofit sector for over 15 years. My expertise lies in information management and technology, and providing nonprofits the advice, the support that they need in using and benefiting technology for the best of their, for achieving their impacts and their missions. And I want to start with one more thing. Perfection is a misnomer. And challenge, it is a challenge to try to defend it and a challenge to be in that position. So I am perfectly happy experiencing good enough and having come up with examples as to why. So one of the things that helped me get to this point was when I first started out my career in the private sector. I happened to be on several projects, just one after another, known as death march projects. A show of hands, does anybody know the definition of a death march project? Ah, well, then you're lucky. So a death march project in project management is one that is, by the people that are working on it, doomed for failure due to unsustainable working hours. That's basically because these projects were mismanaged in terms of their estimations of budget, time, and scope. So after living this for 6 years, I started noticing a pattern as to, I started questioning the pattern of what we were following. Why were we getting into these positions? We had spent on several of these projects years, months or years, trying to finish an analysis, a perfect set of requirements in order to be implemented. And yet, we were on these death march projects. So something was definitely wrong. So after that, I actually founded my own company in New York City. And based on the concept of not having death march projects anymore, I wanted to advise nonprofits and other organizations in helping them understand what was really important and what they should focus on. And so this leads me to my definition, my professional definition of good enough. Good enough to me is an iterative approach. You start with what is good enough for now and something that can be built in the future. Again, look at the perspective I'm coming from. I'm coming from an information technology background, a background that delivers systems to people, a background that offers support in digital transformations. Now, the big thing that, the big advantage for me when I started not only steering my career in this direction, but also providing advice, strategic advice to nonprofits in core business operations and programs, was the following. The one thing that you do achieve with good enough is, one, a minimum viable product. Has anybody heard that word before? MVP. Ah, I see a hand there in the background, and a few more here. So that is, by definition, a set of features that satisfy early customers and helps provide feedback on where you want to go. That's number one. That's the part of good enough that I'd like to emphasize. The second is exactly the point I made earlier, which was getting feedback. You get to see what is going to work and what's not going to work. We actually applied this at the American Red Cross Information in International Services Division, where we rolled out a global disaster management system. This was a second attempt. We were dealing with people who had gone through a lot of fatigue with a failure in the past in the same direction. And what we did was to make sure that we put out something that people could see, could touch, could feel, could use, could try out, and then build on it in the future. That did not mean that we didn't know what the entire broad spectrum of requirements were going to be. But it did allow us, one, to get feedback, and second, to produce something that, that would lay the foundation for improvements in the future. And this is the approach I have applied for a long time, and I'm still doing it. And so this is why I personally believe in the good enough approach from what I bring professionally to the nonprofit sector. And just one thing more, I am not in a debate with Lars. I support Lars in this, so I hope this conversation becomes a little bit more engaging and collaborative. So.
Good. It's nice to be back, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. I had prepared some remarks, but then Sandra mentioned parenting and kids, and then my mind gravitated into the 10-year-old complex sudden onset emergency I have at home called David. And I think the reason that my mind went there is that good enough is, I think, something very personal. It is something about how we as professionals cope in situations where actually we can't cope, where we cannot live up to the standards that we have and cannot always deliver the products that we want to deliver, right? And as they say in the humanitarian sector, that's not a bug, that's a feature. Those are the conditions we work under, so we have to come to terms with it. I work with decision-making support. I work with telling stories about crises, coming up with a humanitarian narrative, if you want, to help people understand what has happened. Now, if you think about the information space we have in doing that, I think it's characterized by three things. One, it is very dynamic. Things change all the time. We saw the ESRI presentation make that point very eloquently. Secondly, we always have information gaps, right? Many of the events we work with are black swans. We don't know their true nature until we have really looked at them for a while. And so things we don't know is also just something that's with us always. And then thirdly, we have to make decisions under great time pressure. So we don't know what's going on. It changes all the time, and we have to do something. And if you try to apply anything apart from a good enough approach in a context like that, you will fail. And when I look back at my career and think about some of the most painful professional experiences I have had, they are very closely linked to not being able to let go and do just good enough. Right? And so for me, it is it's a personal issue, and it's not second best. It's not sloppy. It's the only sensible choice that we can make. It's easy to hide behind your job description. You get your terms of reference, you go to the field, and there are 5 bullets on them, and once you've done those 5 bullets, you've done your bit, and you can feel happy about yourself. And I think we've all been in places where we have a couple of hundred people, each with their job description, doing exactly what they say, and yet somehow things seem not to work. I think that's very closely linked to not working in a good enough manner. It's about about being careful with how you spend your bandwidth. It's about being able to not just being strapped into a hamster wheel, running faster and faster, trying to cover a gap that cannot be covered, by actually having the courage to stop up, look at what is the purpose of what we're doing, prioritizing and with intention deciding what to do about a situation that cannot look good, that cannot be good, and then delivering the best you can. And here comes then the final, most important bit, and then making yourself accountable for the choices that you make. I think the thing I like most about a good enough approach, as I understand it, is that it puts the accountability on us as professionals. Right? We can't hide behind our job titles or terms of reference or our data sets or whatever. You know it won't work unless you make some hard choices. And it's upon you to make yourself accountable. Say, look, I was in this situation. It really sucked in many ways. I had to make a choice. This is the choice I made. I thought that was good enough. What do you think? And I think that sort of mindset is what can help us do better in the field. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think it's already food for thought. When we first met for this stand-up, I was looking for somebody to, let's say, defend this thesis of the good enough, and somebody to challenge the thesis. But unfortunately, I think you're both very much convinced about this approach. So I say, well, why not? I'll be the challenger then. And first, I mean, as a practitioner, I have noticed in terms of being a manager or being managed sometimes, that usually people will refer when it comes to this good enough approach, that according to this Pareto principle, I think I have a slide for those who are not familiar with this approach, you know that that's something that said, well, 80% of let's say the effort will serve only 20% of the result. So in terms of management, usually people will say, don't focus on this 20% because it's useless. It's too much energy for little results at the end. But devil's in the detail. And other people will say that because we are expert, because we are looking for something very special about humanity, about what's going on the field, that we perhaps should focus on this 20% of achievement that takes 80% of our energy. What do you think about that? How do you make your choice when it comes to you? How do you decide what it is about, what is good enough? And how do you decide personally or with your team when it's time to close the topics because it's good enough? The floor is yours.
I must say these questions took a lot of my time these past few weeks trying to think about it. So hopefully this will be helpful to you. So the first thing I want to start with in response to that question is, I hope no one here assumes and associates good enough with inaccuracy, because that's not what it is. I think before we start into what helps us decide what's good enough, I think we should just take one tiny step back and say, why do we do good enough? Or why do those of us who believe in it actually implement it? And the answer to that, based on the experience that, based on my experience, professional experiences have been, because we want to produce something that is timely, that is useful, that is impactful in the time, budget, and resources that we are afforded. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a scarcity, but that does mean that we're being very mindful of what the target audience needs immediately. And one of the things that I try to be very careful of is, can the users, the target audience in my case, because we're producing information systems, is can they make a decision in this iteration with the kinds of features and functionalities that we're providing them? That's what's most important to me. And do we have enough so that we can go build on it and move into the future? Now, there is a bit of practicality to be introduced here, because I'm putting on a lens here around digital transformations, which can be really huge in certain organizations, but can be a step that takes an organization from the past into the future with very little. And that's what, I've seen the spectrum in the nonprofit sector. But the point being that you are changing the lives of the people that are going to be using these systems. You're changing the way they're going to work, and thus the impact that they're going to have in the sector. And so what you really need to be mindful of is, are you giving them enough now to be able to make that leap? And if not, what is your plan B? So my plan B, whenever trying to introduce a transformative change, is to say, look, your world is going to be in two parts. One is going to be in the transformation that we're giving you, and the other is going to be in the world that you've been used to. And how do I help you transition that? And that involves very simple things. And if I can just explain that entire statement with an example is, let's say you're moving an organization from paper to an online cloud-based system. That's not going to happen overnight, is it? And if it's not going to happen overnight, how do you determine which processes are reflected in the new system and which ones are not? And for those that are going to be reflected, you need to make sure that you're spending enough time with your users to be able to adjust to that lifestyle, that way of working. And for those that are not reflected, you give them a way to continue in parallel. So whether that means saying we're going to set up a team that works with you in the way that you do work today, and we'll also help you in using the new system. That's another way to look at things. So good enough for me, how do I decide good enough? Is one, based on context, second, based on my users, third, based on am I giving them enough to make a decision and to move forward? And that conversation actually is not a one-time conversation, because good enough is iterative. So is it good enough for now? And you have to take the opinion of the people that are getting affected by the information products that you're serving them. I'm open to questions and comments on this point because these are probably better served with examples and sharing experiences. So if there isn't enough clarity, please open it up. We're here to answer your questions and share experiences.
So Vincent said the devil is in the detail. I'd like to make the opposite argument. I think the angel is also in the detail. Right? And for me, the good enough bit is a lot about having enough bandwidth to go look for that angel. Right? You sort of have to catch all the devils to avoid the negative consequences of them. But if you can find a couple of angels, those critical key issues that really make a difference, and iron them out, then you get a better result. Now, you won't find the angels if you're strapped into the hamster wheel that I spoke about before. If you're so busy cleaning your data that you even forget to think about what is it actually that this decision maker will get out of the map I'm doing right now. I'm sometimes afraid when I see these presentations with extremely granular maps like we saw before. What I think is not fantastic and great colors, I think that looks precisely wrong to me in a disaster situation. Right? If we just run around trying to scrape as much data together as we can and plaster it on a map, and don't ask the critical issue of not what's the answer, but what is the question? What is it actually that we need to know in this situation? If we don't manage to do that, I think we can produce a tremendous amount of maps or products which don't really make a difference. And I don't think we'll have the bandwidth to think like that, to ensure that our intention is right, unless we work according to this and leave those 20% alone. I think those 20% are really dangerous. I think they can suck us into a never-ending process which just ends up imploding or being, what did you call it? A death march, right? And so that for me is the real danger. It links somehow also to the humanitarian principles that we work according to, right? I think every single one of us have an obligation to understand what those principles mean in a certain context. What is it actually that we as a community must do here? Otherwise, we're just a bunch of robots running around producing maps. And that doesn't do anything good for anybody. So for me, good enough is a way of ensuring that on one side, we can cope with highly imperfect situations. It's also a way of ensuring that we move together as a swarm in the right direction because we have the same principles that drive us and we have time to think about them. It's said in the paper we see beforehand, how do we then institutionalize this? What kind of policy can we have for this? And I don't think policy is the answer to this. I think we need to think in terms of culture. How do you create a culture internally which allows for people to work good enough? Right? And one of the previous speakers spoke about trust. I think that's key. I tend to think there are three elements to enabling a good enough approach to working. One is trust. You need to be enabling, so create an environment where people can actually do their job. You need to be trusting, and you need to be disruptive, if that makes sense. I think if we have a place where people generally can work and are trusted, they can also deal with the disruptions which will enable them to then focus in on the right issues. And that's not achieved through a policy, in my book. I think we have to think about how do we incentivize that? How do we incentivize each other to work good enough? How do we give each other license to work good enough? And it's great that you have a fail fest tonight because that's part of that, right? How do we come to terms with the things that don't work and see them not as shameful experiences, but as critical learning for us as a community? Thank you.
Thank you to you. I was just reminding somebody that I like, a researcher who said his name is Edgar Schwen, is working on how to help, and he says that helping is not really providing an answer. You'd better help if you provide the right question to the person or to the group. I think there is something in this conversation. Well, I think it's time for you to step in a conversation. And perhaps let's continue on what Lars introduced earlier. The fact that, well, I see, at least according from my perspective, that this, let's say, concept of a good enough approach has become very consensual. I don't know, perhaps you have some different position here in the room. But what I see also is the fact that this concept is turning now in some kind of standard operating procedures in organization. I don't know to what extent. You say that it can't really be turned in those standards, but perhaps from your perspective and experience, you want to share something on that. At the end, I would like us to discuss about, do we consider that we are better informed now that since this good enough approach has been applied? It has been more than 10 years already. And how is this reflected in the programmatic decision? I mean, for those who are working in the field, who are already connected to the field, I think it will be very interesting to share their experience. So the floor is yours. We have 2 mobile mic in the room, so please stand up. Please stand up to express yourself, and please introduce yourself. And just to conclude, we have 20 minutes, 25, so well, we have enough time to continue the conversation.
Hi, I'm Alex Orenstein. I'm the GIS manager for West Africa for Action Contre la Faim. I want to thank both of you for your interventions. One of the things that strikes my mind when I think about good enough is, as well, do no harm, something that we need to keep in mind. And what I find particularly worrying in the humanitarian sector when it comes to good enough and do no harm is that we don't really have any sort of industry-wide standard for data at all. I mean, for field projects, for implementation, we have Sphere. For the WASH, there's minimum standards. There are quite a few standards when it comes to cash, food security interventions, but when it comes to data quality, there is no such standard. We're left in this sort of Wild West, Thunderdome kind of situation. And that's where I think we really need to think about it, when that's good enough for one actor might be different for another, and that's when the harm can come in. I think we've all got experiences where we've seen bad programmatic decisions being taken because of a clerical error in data. We probably all have a horror story from that. So I just wanted to share that thought on data standards for good enough.
Hello, so this is Florent Bellecarats again from AFD. Thank you for these very inspiring thoughts. I see 2 major shortcomings for these good enough approaches, which I will illustrate with concrete examples. But before, I would like to say that I think good enough is right as long as you remain in this H2H perimeter. I think that we in my line of business evaluation, we often say that we evaluate for 3 reasons. First is operational learning, to provide insights to improve interventions. A second is for accountability, to give accounts on the results, on the good use of the resources we received. And the third one is to build knowledge, to produce scientific insights, to know better what works and what doesn't. I think that good enough is very good for the first one, but I will take 2 examples for the 2 other ones where I think it has very strong drawbacks. The first one is for accountability, because I live in a world where there is a lot of competition and where every institution is incentivized to brag about the huge results and the number of beneficiaries. And what I see from where I work is that this good enough approach makes us inflating the number of beneficiaries of our interventions. If I would sum up all the peoples who we have created jobs for in all what we've financed in the development thing, there would be no one without a job on Earth. I mean, we are just overestimating everything because we don't take if with this good enough approach helps me to just consider every person I've ever worked with as a beneficiary and as someone have saved from poverty, from certain death, from illness, from this kind of thing. And so there is, I think, this good enough should be also then shared with our communication departments in order to be not to be too quick into translating the information produced in an operational framework into results that are being displayed. The second aspect is about knowledge. I think I will take a concrete example of cholera, for instance. I think that bad research, good enough research on cholera, has us focusing on the has had us focusing on the wrong drivers for cholera dissemination during decades. We have been focusing exclusively on purity of drinking water, because the good enough evidences we had about the sources of cholera were that people had cholera because they had bad drinking water, while better research is now producing evidence that it's much more complex and that most of the quick response that we've been doing for the last decades were not the more appropriate. So I think this should be this might be two drawbacks of the good enough approaches.
Well, thank you, Florent. I think you raised the issue of this age-to-age versus the field approach. I think it's time to perhaps Lars and Sonia, we want to comment because you are representing both the age-to-age and the field perspective.
Yeah. I think the first thing I'd like to say, excellent contributions from both of you. I don't think good enough is something we want to do always. I think there's a domain within which we want to work with a good enough approach. And research is definitely not one of them. What we're talking about here is how do we create a feedback loop that is quick enough to actually influence decisions while they're being made. And in that, I firmly believe that we need to work with a good enough approach. You mentioned we've all seen mistakes being made due to clerical errors in the data and so on. I mean, I'm all for data standards, don't get me wrong. But I have seen far more decisions, bad decisions being made because everybody was on autopilot. There was no proper evidence on the table because it was still being produced, and everything just deteriorated into politics. Those are the bad decisions I see most of. And that's where I think a good enough approach can go in and help alleviate some of those. It's those mistakes we make every single time, right? It's those things that drive us mad because you go to the field and you're like, Jesus, are we still doing this, right? We've all seen that. And for me, we simply have to produce something which is timely and can influence in the moment. But it's very different from doing good research on cholera. That for me is a different domain. And I wouldn't personally advocate for a good enough, good enough approach in that area. I should have made that clear. Secondly, H2H. I think H2H can play a role in this because we are incentivized in a slightly different way. We are in a sense one-trick ponies. Like we're highly technical, small outfits that only do one thing and do that really well. And our credibility hinges on being able to do that well. And I think in the interaction with the more mainstream humanitarian organizations, that's where our complementarity come in. That if we can create a good collaboration with them, we can drive this practical, good enough, quick feedback loop, which is founded in a very strong technical capability. So that is how I see H2H fitting into the good enough discussion.
I had made a comment on the last question that had been posed by Vincent, and that was that information products and information systems are only as good as the people using them and as good as the people that have the experience to form and make a strategic decision. So I think that it's really important to bring that kind of expertise that people have seen over the years while trying to use information products and tools to support them, and that is undeniable. So while it may not apply to some of the comments some of you have said, it does apply to the fact that people with experience must apply that experience with the tools that are being provided to them, because it cannot be taken at blanket value, and those products and tools will only become enriched with the experience that's being brought to the table. So hopefully some mistakes could have been caught in the past. Hopefully, if there was such a massive erroneous approach taken to cholera, somebody could have caught it. I mean, there has to be enough experience and expertise in the sector to have said, well, why are we doing it this way? And so I feel like that cannot be underplayed in any way.
Thank you. You mentioned several times that it's also about the feedback approach. Well, I like this perspective personally because, Brandon, you mentioned during your earlier speech, you make a quote about Darwin. But I also like the Darwin perspective when the person says that the ecosystem works only if there is feedback coming from all parts of the system. If not, it doesn't work at all. So I think it reflects perhaps, I mean, let's think about this, development and humanitarian system, how it works, and this good enough approach participates to this feedback system. Next.
Hello, my name is Justin Lyle. I work for the Czech international NGO People in Need. So thank you very much for your contributions. It's a really interesting discussion. And it's nice that it's quite high level. Of course, the quality of these systems and products that you're talking about also depends on the quality of the information that goes into them, as we're saying. I just want to say, if we think about indicators, for example, if you're trying to measure the impact, map the impact of a project in different locations, then the quality of the indicators and the accuracy of the data collection itself is crucial to that product. So I just want to make a little side comment, which hopefully will not seem annoying to you. But we, in our organization, we've developed a very special kind of guidance on indicators, which I'm going to be presenting at this conference, which is called IndiKit. And it helps people to get really accurate data. I'm going to talk about that later, so I won't waste more of your time on that. Okay, when we talk about the good enough thing, I think our discussion is a little bit lost in different frames of reference. So we were talking about research, and then we're talking about operational decision-making in a humanitarian response. We, in our organization, are trying to develop a beneficiary management system. So maybe you could give some kind of practical insights and experience. Where would be the areas where you would kind of strive for absolute detail and excellence? Where would be the areas where you would not aim for that and just go for a good enough approach?
Okay, well, it almost seems like we need to have a 2-minute requirement session. So when you talk about beneficiary management, can I just get a sense of the context that you're working in? Is it if it's a disaster preparedness, if it's a disaster-oriented situation, then you need to figure out what are the most common needs that people would need in a particular disaster and for how long. I guess the time would matter to me. I'm sort of thinking out loud. For me, as a technologist and having been thrown this sentence of beneficiary management, I would certainly focus on the past as well, as to what did work. Why are you in this? Why are you in this situation? Why do you want to build it? What did it fail in the past? Were attempts made that did not work, or did something actually did work and you want to build on it? Those are the kinds of questions that I would ask initially as a technologist. Is this the direction you want to go with this response? I can change my my concept as well. Yes? No? Okay. And the other thing that I would also focus on is who is ultimately going to be using this system, this beneficiary management system? Are they going to be people from your staff? Are the people going to be in the field? Is this going to be something purely headquarters oriented? Is there going to be direct interaction with the beneficiary and collection of data from them into the system? Those are the kinds of things that I would also look at. And don't forget, to me, beneficiaries obviously mean in areas of that lack infrastructure. So some of the things to think about are, in what environments will this system be imposed to work on? So those are some things you look at from a more practical aspect as well. In terms of data, some of the things that I would look at, there's a big focus on data protection. So you need to make sure that if it's involving beneficiary management, beneficiary data management, then you need to introduce privacy by design in the concept as well. Also look at the data that has already been collected, which is looking at the past, and to see what part of this is actually useful, not useful, should be migrated, should not be migrated. So I'm giving you both strategic as well as very practical perspectives, and I would be more than happy to have a more detailed coffee break with you on some of these systems, but I just need a little bit more context. But at the very least, look at these things. And obviously, another more practical perspective is if you're building a system, you make a very, very strong case for whether it is something that you would use a commercial off-the-shelf or custom development. Those are also things to be considered on a more practical perspective. That's what I bring to the conversation. So hopefully this is helpful to you. Yeah, sure.
We still have 5 minutes to continue.
Can
Lars,
I just make a couple of quick
please.
remarks? So to speak to your question on domains, so where does it belong and where doesn't it belong? I think it's about uncertainty. What level of uncertainty are we operating with? And I think there are two fundamentally different kinds of uncertainty. One is information gaps, so there's stuff we don't know. And the other one is uncertainty as to the nature of the problem we're dealing with. Right? So in a sense, what is the question and what is the answer? Those are two different kinds of uncertainty. And you provided an example of how inappropriate color research or wrong color research led to bad decisions. I'd like to quickly sketch out the opposite example where we did too good, in a sense. Pakistan floods 2010, we did an initial assessment with a sample size of 2,400 households and 400 focus group discussions. It took us 3 weeks to collect the data, maybe another week to clean and analyze. By the time we put out the report, we didn't influence anything because all the major decisions had been made, right? And so in that case, I was the on-deck team leader doing that operation, and for me, the great frustration afterwards is that I could see how, in retrospect, we distributed resources according to where the flooding hit time-wise, rather than where the needs were. So in a sense, the North got served better than the South, right? And had we done a more good enough approach that quickly outlined what do we know, every day came up with a new update, maybe did some forward-looking projections, we would have maybe been able to avoid that mistake. But that was a massive mistake. And that was because we did too good, not because we did good enough.
Well, thank you. I think it's a good introduction for the fail fest we'll have over the next 3 days. Anyone?
Thank you, Lars and Sonia. It's so interesting. I want to talk to you at the break. It's Shelley Gornell. I'm an information management officer at UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. Two things. One is I just want to plead with everyone when they're thinking about good enough to not sacrifice the voices of marginalized communities, especially when you're doing needs assessments. Because it's easier, yes, to do key informants than focus group discussions and household level interviews. It's easier to go to men who are tribal leaders or from the dominant ethnicity. Yes, it's easier. But then what you wind up happening is actually you have these dominant voices that represent the experiences and issues of 20% of the population being represented as 80% of the population. And you haven't actually done that graph at all, because most of the people are elderly, children, women, minorities, and they might even have the greater needs. So just a plea for that not to be sacrificed on the chopping block. The second thing, though, is I think there's internal good enough and there's also external good enough. And I don't know if we've been talking about the external good enough and how we treat each other when people share data. And I think sometimes there's a mood in certain operations where people think I'm going to get cut down if I share my raw data in this room. People are out to get me. They're going to, and that mood is really toxic. And it would be good to establish more trust so that people who do have the courage to share their data and their metadata don't get cut down. Maybe we won't use the data because it's not sufficiently accurate for certain regions, but we should be polite enough that this person has trusted enough to share it in a way that it can be used if it is valuable. So I think that type of goodwill is important for the open data movement.
Thank you. I've been told that the coffee is ready, and we should go, and it's under the first floor. Perhaps it's the way to continue conversation. Lars and Sonia, I understand you'll be around the full day, right? So I think if you want to continue or to go deeper or further in the conversation, they are here around. So let's go upstairs. Coffee break for 15 minutes. Thank you very much, Sonia and Lars, for introducing this debate and opening the floor. And thank you to you for your contribution, because this is really the spirit of this event, to feel free and to share the questions that are part of our daily work.